present, Marion, members. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, David Knight. David comes to us from Transpower, where he has been the General Counsel and Company Secretary since 2007. Prior to joining Transpower, David was General Counsel at Telecom in New Zealand, my old stamping ground, and it was quite good before to catch up on some of the things that have happened to Telecom in the intervening years. David holds an honours degree in law from the University of Auckland and a master's degree in law from the Harvard Law School, which he attended as a Fulbright scholar. Prior to his career in law, David was involved in the wine industry, including periods as winemaker, wine merchant and wine judge, and I presume, like me, wine drinker. Today, David will take a look at how our future energy needs will impact our electricity distribution systems and markets. David.
Thank you very much, John. It's nice to see a couple of old Telecom faces here. I caught up briefly with Dr. Milner over the fellowship break, so that was nice. I thought my skills as a constitutional lawyer might be called upon to give you some assistance around the nature of your constitution and the intersection with your bylaws, but fortunately you were able to avoid that and move on to better things. But look, thank you for inviting me to talk briefly about what Transpower calls our energy futures, or Te Mauri Hiko. Alison would have been here, but she's on leave today, so I'm deputising for her. And we'll talk through the work program that we have in place around Te Mauri Hiko. Transpower's got two principal roles. First is that we own and operate the national grid, and that's about 78,000 kilometres of lines up and down the country. And the other role that we have is we're the system operator, which means we run the power system in real time, and that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And we operate out of two centres, one in Wellington, one in Hamilton. They both operate in real time and at the same time, so there's always redundancy if there's a crisis in one city or the other, as there was on Saturday morning when I got locked out and my temporary card didn't work, which meant I could call someone in the 24-hour control room, and they came down and rescued me, so that was good. The running a power, I'm a lawyer, so I can speak to you in broad terms. But if anyone's got any very technical questions about running a power system or how electricity actually operates, then I'd direct them to Dr. Milner, who can answer most of those questions anyway. The power system, my previous chief executive, Patrick Strange, explained it as essentially a seesaw. The power system always has to be in balance, can't fall over. And on that seesaw, you've got on one side, a couple of dozen generators who are essentially huge sumo wrestlers. And on the other side, you've got all the consumers, lots and lots of hundreds of thousands, millions of consumers sitting on the other side of the seesaw, and it's always in balance. And any time you drop either one of the sumo wrestlers off or some of the consumers off, then you've got to find the balance. And so running the power system is essentially about trying to keep that thing in balance. And so today, for example, where we've taken Matamata out to do some work, then you've got to drop some generation off the other side. And so and that's how the market ultimately works. But we at Transpower wanted to recognise the government's commitments to a decarbonised world by 2050, and so we started a piece of work called Te Mauri Hiko, which looked at what has to be right for us to achieve those climate change ambitions. That is, to run a power system at 100% renewable energy by 2050. And how did that work? And so we looked quite deeply at the inputs into the power system and what our role was in helping the government achieve its Paris Agreement commitments. And what we launched was Te Mauri Hiko. I've got a couple of copies of it here, 2 or 3 if anyone's interested, but I'd invite you to go onto the Transpower website if you wanted to have a look at some of the more detailed pieces around that. We engaged a group called Stakeholder Strategies to help us work our way through what those various inputs into what the power system would look like, what the inputs would look like, what the supply and demand scenarios would look like by 2050, and then what our response to that was going to be. And essentially we produced a series of models that modelled the socio-political demand for climate change. We looked at international inputs into that. We looked at what was happening in New Zealand and how that was going to resonate. We looked at a whole range of inputs from electric car take-up to what was happening in GDP, what was happening in housing, and used those drivers to help understand and build a number of scenarios that we then tried to track out what ultimately the electricity usage was going to be across the national grid. And those scenarios broke down into four base cases that we use to help, and you might not be able to read that, so I'll just go through them quickly. The first was, and the base case that we use is NZ Inc., and that has climate change, abrupt climate change, not occurring. So that is, we're able to manage our way through climate change. The world remains basically integrated, so it doesn't break up into disparate. So this is the geopolitical perspective, and a world where future tech is adopted. So essentially a bright global situation for New Zealand and our role in that. And then the next one down is Vibrant Haven, and that's a world where the geopolitical environment is a little less solid and a little less stable than it is now, and we find that New Zealand becomes a bit of a haven for folk who are exiting or trying to find a safe haven from other parts of the world, and that's already occurring in parts of the South Island, where you can find wealthy Europeans and Americans establishing their bolt holes here. The next was the Mobilise case, and that sits in between in terms of demand scenarios, in between NZ Inc. and Vibrant Haven, and that is the call to technology hasn't quite taken on to the same extent as the NZ Inc. Scenario, and we haven't become that vibrant haven that we identified in the other scenario. And the final scenario is struggling alone. And what you'll see from that is that we are completely isolated from the rest of the world, that geopolitical environment has turned sour. Remember, we're mapping ourselves out to 2050, and so if we look at the last 5 or 10 years even in geopolitical politics, things have moved enormously. No one would have ever expected a president like Trump, for example, even 5 years ago. So things can move quite quickly. So we analysed a base case that saw New Zealand struggling alone, that we didn't have international partners, we didn't have international trade to the same extent. The world was disaggregated or disconnected, and we hadn't been able to adopt future technology in the way that we had. And those four base case scenarios gave us the basis for trying to figure out what electricity demand was going to occur over the coming years. And we analysed 8 or 9 other scenarios as well, and they are available if you wanted to have a look through those on our website. But those are the 4 base case scenarios that we looked at and analysed. And the key trends that map out for us gave us the basis for what essentially becomes a forward planning set of scenarios. And I'm going to walk over to the screen and point out a couple of things in a second just so you can see. No, I'm not. I'm going to turn it off altogether. What's happened? Oh, there we go. We're missing... go back. Well, we are missing something, but it probably doesn't matter because I'm going to walk over here and shout at you. So what we saw was that total energy demand, that's the demand for energy in the entire economy, not just electricity, that dropped from about 163 up here down to what is 143 there. So it's a drop in total energy demand. And the reason for that is that our energy usage becomes a lot more efficient. So electricity is a lot more efficient fuel than hydrocarbons and coal. And so from that perspective, we saw a dropping in total energy demand. But what you'll see here is total electricity demand increases from about 43 or 44 here up to 88, so essentially a doubling. So one of the key findings for the Te Māori Hiko work was, and these are terawatts, energy or electricity demand doubling between now and 2050, which if we are going to have a total renewable supply is a bit of a shock, because what we have here at the moment is the total renewable energy supply sitting at around about 42, 41 terawatts in 2018. And total generation sits here. So there's a huge gap between what the total energy demand is going to be, what the total electricity demand is, and what we actually have in New Zealand at the moment. So that set of scenarios helped us map out where we're headed. Now, we're on a bit of a high side in terms of where the analysis is done. There are other commentators, including MB, who see total electricity demand a little lower than that, but not a lot lower. The Productivity Commission has come in about here. So we're in the right trajectory, and one of the reasons why our base case is higher than others is we see a lot more call for solar in the power system. So I'm just going to get on to what presents the greatest problem for us, and that is what we call this winter deficit, a 12 terawatt gap in cold winters, where energy demand and electricity supply have a gap. So this is the total demand on this little red line here, and this is generation that occurs, and you can see in the winter months there's this huge deficit where we can't cover that at the moment. So one of the findings for us was that to get to where we need to by 2050 in terms of renewable energy, we need something in the order of about 4.5 average-sized wind farms every year between now and 2050. Now, just to give you an example of where we're tracking at the moment, since this change of government, since the government has come into power, I'm not picking that as a problem, just simply saying that's a data point, that is the previous government didn't have much more renewable either. The only generation that we have commissioned, Transpower, in that time has been 2 gas-fired peakers in Taranaki. So there still is no renewable energy on the horizon. There's a lot of wind that's been consented in various places, but very hard to get that through into the power system. And one of the peculiarities of running a power system like ours is that when you've got lots of hydro running it, you get lots of inertia, which makes a very stable power system. Once you start adding wind and solar into the power system, then it starts to become a lot more fickle, a lot harder to control, and so it makes it more difficult to get to the critical points that you need when you need to switch power on and off very quickly. I'll give you an example. Last weekend, we took the HVDC link that links the North and South Islands out for its annual service. At that same time, one of the gas generators in Taranaki was out. Even then, one of the Rankine units that runs Huntly was out, and that meant that, and it was a day like this, when it wasn't blowing anywhere, so there was no wind in the power system. So we had to make a call with about 5 minutes to spare to bring the HVDC link back into service again, just to cover the morning peaks, because it was also cold. So it was cold in the morning, it was atypically still for a November day, which meant that there wasn't enough wind, there was certainly no solar at that point, so we had to bring generation back on in that form. And so that sort of scenario maps out over the course of a dry winter in a much more difficult way. In a couple of minutes, so I'll jet to the finish. So we're charting a course, and we're working on a range of these scenarios. We're trying to fine-tune our modelling so that we can see whether there are opportunities for us. We put a great deal of store on solar, but one of the problems we've got with solar is most of it will sit on the other side of the grid. So you can imagine the grid's running, there's a distributor, and then there's a meter, and then sitting on the other side of that is you with your solar cells on your house. Getting that back into our power system and being able to aggregate it and use it is one of the biggest challenges that we have moving forward, not to mention the safety issues that go with generation being on the other side of the grid as well. So that's one of the challenges for us, but we're up to it. Te Māori Hiko has been quite an amazing publication for us. It's been mentioned in Parliament and parliamentary questions, with both sides of the House using it to bash the other, essentially, as to where their commitments are. But the critical point for us is we still have an awful lot of work to do to get ourselves to a completely renewable space by 2050. So there we are. Thank you very much. That's a quick run through.
We've got time for three questions. Yes, Duncan and then Peter.
I understand that the wind farm in Palmerston North has been very disappointing. Geothermal's going south rather than north. No coal, no gas. Is there any role for nuclear in New Zealand?
We don't see a role for nuclear. It certainly doesn't feature in our planning horizon. There are some. We've gone back and had a look at some of the historical records, and from the 60s and 70s, there were a number of papers that were produced around a nuclear option for New Zealand. But in the current horizon, and certainly in the time horizon that we're talking about, we don't see nuclear in there as an option.
Peter?
David, thank you for your presentation. You're the system operator, not the generator.
Correct.
How much involvement have you had with Contact, Transpower, with
The others?
etc., in terms of producing Te Māori Hiko and your vision for the future?
Yeah, well, look, we've had a lot of engagement with them, and so we had, in terms of setting up Te Māori Hiko, we had a number of interest groups, including among the generators, to pull them in. And then as we produced it, we put our demand scenarios out for them, and they have different perspectives. You can imagine that Genesis running Huntly sees a lot more of a future for gas and even for coal. In fact, as you know, they've been shipping in coal from Indonesia to run the Rankine units at Huntly now. So, and Contact has a slightly different perspective, and Meridian as well. But all of them have the same trajectory. They just end up at a slightly different point. And everyone identifies that dry winter gap as a problem. We have to be able to solve that.
Alex?
Hello, David. I'm just wondering if you can comment. I noticed in your first picture, I think you might have had a hydrogen heavy as one of the pictures. So I wonder if you could just comment on the future perspective that Transpower has around hydrogen and also just solar and potentially other energy mixes such as offshore wind.
Sure. Well, look, I'll do those in reverse order. We saw quite a big future for offshore wind. The thing about wind is no one wants to have a pylon in their backyard, but no one wants a wind farm either. And so we saw offshore wind as having a great deal of potential. In terms of hydrogen, we didn't see a huge future for hydrogen. You still got to. The thing about hydrogen is you have to be able to make it. So you need generation to be able to produce it. And so we didn't see it. We saw it as a useful storage option, but it's not going to solve that 12 terawatt problem that we've got. Distributed solar as well as grid scales solar, we do see they're working out at about 20% in terms of the future supply stack that we have. The problem is you're getting ourselves to a point where that tipping point, whereas at the moment it's still uneconomic for most people to have solar, but we don't see very many years before you can get to a point where you can almost paint a solar film on your roof or in other places and be able to develop that. The problem we've got in New Zealand is not everywhere can produce solar, and so you get to about south of Nelson and thereabouts, and solar starts to become a real problem because you just don't have enough sunshine hours.
Tony?
David, thank you. As a lawyer, you've done extremely well. I know nothing about electricity, but you've got extremely well. I read an article called Abundance Insider, and the guy that writes this is proposing that by 2047 we will have the battery technology to be able to capture the energy provided by the sun. And what he's saying is that by 2047, 6% of the sun's energy will be enough to meet all of the energy requirements of the entire universe. Have you got any comment on that?
Well, look, I haven't seen the projections, but there's plenty of energy in the sun and in solar power. Our issue is to be able to harness that and store it. So you have to be able to capture it and hold on to it so that you can use it in what we call seasonal shifting. So we still will have a deficit in winter because there's just not enough sun in winter. So you've got to capture it in summer, store it somehow, and then move that into your winter usage. And the battery technology we have at the moment just isn't good enough to be able to capture it for that length of time. Hydrogen's an option for storage, so you might be able to capture it, generate from it, produce some hydrogen, store it in the form of ammonia or something like that, and then use that in winter. And then there are other more, like pumped hydro and other storage options that might come into some sort of economic picture, but probably in 10 or 20 years' time.
Thank you. We've run out of time, so John, can you ask?
Thank you very much, David, for your very interesting talk, and in particular in describing your task in managing the seesaw today, tomorrow, 24 hours a day, out for the next 30 to 40 years. A very challenging task. I guess the lack of storage in New Zealand is a really striking feature of New Zealand's generation system, and I think you brought that home really to us today. David, on behalf of the club, I'd like to present to you this token of our appreciation. And members, please join me in thanking David.